I never expected a single glance across my friend's kitchen to change everything, but the way she looked at me that day, calm, confident, and just a little amused, lit a spark I couldn't ignore. I still remember the way the air felt that afternoon, warm, heavy with the scent of jasmine drifting in from the garden. The house was quiet, except for the faint hum of a ceiling fan. I was just there to return a book to my friend, nothing more. At least, that's what I thought. But the moment I stepped through the front door, something shifted. She was in the kitchen, standing near the window where the sunlight fell in long, golden lines across the tiled floor. Her hair was tied loosely, a few strands framing her face in a way that made her look effortlessly graceful. She wasn't trying to impress anyone, she didn't need to. Her presence carried a kind of calm authority, the kind that draws attention without demanding it. When she turned and saw me, her lips curved into a small, knowing smile. "You're early," she said softly, her voice warm but steady, like she'd been expecting me. I stammered something about the book, but my words tangled halfway through. She didn't tease me for it. Instead, she handed me a glass of iced tea, condensation sliding down the sides, and nodded toward the living room. For a brief second, as I took the glass, our fingers touched. It was nothing, barely more than a brush, but the jolt that followed was real. Her skin was cool from the glass, mine warm from the sun outside. She noticed, I could tell. Her gaze lingered on mine just long enough to make my pulse pick up, but not long enough to be obvious. As I sat down, I found myself studying the details I'd never noticed before, the way she moved with quiet confidence, the soft laugh that slipped out when the cat brushed against her legs, the way the sunlight made her eyes look lighter than I remembered. There was no dramatic moment, no flirtatious remark. Just a subtle, unspoken awareness building between us. My friend arrived a few minutes later, loud and oblivious as usual, and the spell broke. But as we went upstairs, I caught her glance again, a quick, almost playful look over her shoulder, like she knew something I didn't yet. I didn't realize it then, but that was the moment everything quietly began. A glance across a kitchen, a brush of fingertips, and a look that lingered just long enough to leave its mark. The spark wasn't loud. It was silent, but it was real. The days that followed slipped by without any grand declarations or obvious signs, but something between us had shifted. I started noticing her presence in a way I never had before. Every time I visited my friend's house, a quiet part of me hoped she'd be there, reading on the porch, tending to the roses in the garden, or sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea cradled between her hands. Sometimes she'd wave casually when I walked in, as if I were just another familiar face. Other times, her eyes would linger for a fraction of a second longer than necessary, and that was enough to make my heart beat faster. It wasn't about flirtation, it was about a shared awareness, a quiet current running beneath ordinary interactions. One late afternoon, I found her outside, pruning roses in the garden. The sky was turning amber, the air warm and soft. My friend was upstairs, completely absorbed in a game, which left the two of us alone. I walked over, pretending to admire the flowers, but really just drawn to her calm presence. "Careful," she said with a small smile, noticing how close I got to the thorns. "They're beautiful, but they'll hurt you if you're careless." There was something about the way she said it, half teasing, half meaningful, that made me pause. I reached out to steady one of the stems she was trimming, and our hands brushed lightly. The touch was accidental, but the warmth that passed through it wasn't. She hesitated for the briefest moment before pulling her hand back, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear as if nothing had happened. But the silence afterward felt charged, almost fragile. A few days later, I offered to help her carry some groceries in from the car. The sun was dipping low, casting long shadows across the driveway. As I reached for one of the paper bags, our fingers met again, this time directly, palm to palm around the bag's edge. Neither of us let go immediately. She looked up, her expression calm but her eyes, there was something there. A quiet flicker, quickly masked. "Thanks," she said finally, her voice soft. I nodded, unable to think of a clever response. It wasn't the kind of moment that needed words anyway. These small exchanges, glances in the garden, hands brushing over groceries, conversations that wandered just close enough to the edge, were slowly drawing us closer. It wasn't dramatic or rushed. It was quiet, and that made it feel even more real. It happened on a night I hadn't planned to stay long. I'd dropped by to return a book I'd borrowed, expecting to leave it on the hallway table and head home. But when I knocked softly on the door, it wasn't my friend who answered, it was her. She stood there in an oversized cream-colored sweater, her hair down for the night, framing her face in a soft, almost disarming way. The house was quiet, the only light came from the kitchen, spilling a warm glow into the hallway. "He's already asleep," she said with a faint smile. "But you can come in if you want. I'm just having some tea." I stepped inside, the familiar scent of chamomile wrapping around me like a blanket. She moved toward the kitchen with a natural ease, her bare feet making no sound on the tiles. I followed, hesitant at first, then drawn in by the soft calm of the moment. She poured me a cup without asking, sliding it across the counter toward me. I sat at the kitchen island, and she leaned against the opposite side, her arms loosely folded, her eyes steady on mine. For a few minutes, we spoke casually, about the book, about my studies, about nothing in particular. But beneath the surface, something unspoken hummed like a quiet string being plucked. At one point, she tilted her head slightly, studying me in that deliberate way of hers. "You always look like you're about to say something bold," she said with a playful glint. I laughed nervously. "Maybe I am." Her smile deepened, slow and knowing. She pushed away from the counter, closing a bit of the space between us. The soft light caught the edges of her face, making her eyes glow faintly gold. Then she leaned forward, resting her elbows on the counter, narrowing the distance to just a few feet. Her voice dropped, almost to a whisper. "You're too young to be so bold." I like that. The words hung in the air, heavier than they should have been. It wasn't just what she said, it was the way she said it. Warm, teasing, but with an undercurrent that made my chest tighten. For a moment, everything stilled. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The silence between us said enough. Her gaze lingered for one heartbeat longer before she looked away, taking a slow sip of her tea. But the spark was lit. And both of us felt it. As the days went on, what had started as playful glances and quiet moments began to deepen into something neither of us spoke about, but both of us felt. It wasn't about stolen touches anymore. It was about the way conversations began to stretch longer, the way her voice softened when it was just the two of us, the way I started noticing the quiet heaviness in her eyes when she thought no one was looking. One late afternoon, I found her sitting alone on the porch. The sky was fading into soft oranges and pinks, and a gentle breeze rustled through the trees. She had a mug of tea in her hands, staring out at nothing in particular. There was no music, no distraction, just silence and her stillness. Something about that moment made me pause. "Hey," I said quietly, stepping onto the porch. She looked up, surprised but not bothered. "Hey. Your friend's not home." "I know," I replied, leaning on the railing beside her. "I saw your car and thought I'd say hi." She smiled faintly, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then, in a tone far softer than usual, she said, "You ever feel like, everyone assumes you're strong, so they forget to check if you're okay?" The question caught me off guard. She wasn't looking at me as she spoke, her gaze stayed on the horizon. There was a vulnerability in her voice that I hadn't heard before, like a quiet truth slipping out between the cracks. "Yeah," I said honestly. "More than I'd like to admit." She let out a slow, tired laugh. "I'm always the one holding everything together. The dependable one. The calm one. And it's fine, it's just," she trailed off, shaking her head slightly. Without thinking too much, I placed my hand gently over hers, which rested on the wooden armrest of the chair. My touch was light, almost uncertain. She didn't pull away. Instead, she let out a quiet breath, like the kind you release when someone finally sees through the surface. She turned her hand slightly so that our fingers aligned, not interlocked but resting together naturally. Her eyes met mine then, unguarded and soft. There was no teasing in her expression, no playful spark. Just honesty. In that quiet moment on the porch, surrounded by fading light and the smell of warm tea, I stopped seeing her as just someone's mom. I saw her, fully. And something inside both of us shifted. The rain started unexpectedly that evening, one of those warm summer downpours that arrives without warning, heavy and relentless. I had stopped by to drop off a charger I'd borrowed, but as I stepped out of the car, the sky opened up, and I sprinted to the porch just in time to avoid getting soaked. She was already there, standing near the railing, watching the rain with a quiet smile. The porch light cast a soft golden hue around her, and the smell of wet earth filled the air. Her hair was loose, slightly damp from the mist, and strands clung to her cheeks in a way that made her look both elegant and effortlessly human. She turned to me, amused. "Perfect timing," she said, brushing rain droplets from her arm. I laughed breathlessly. "Yeah, I didn't expect this." "Summer rain never asks permission," she replied, stepping back under the shelter as the rain intensified. Thunder rumbled faintly in the distance, and for a while, we both just stood there, watching the downpour. When the wind picked up, she disappeared inside for a moment and returned with a thick blanket. "You'll catch a cold like that," she said, draping it over my shoulders before wrapping part of it around herself too. It was a simple act, but suddenly, we were standing close, closer than usual, our shoulders brushing beneath the shared warmth. The air between us shifted. The rain became background music to something quieter, more intense. She turned slightly toward me, her eyes reflecting the porch light and the storm beyond. Neither of us spoke for a long moment. The only sounds were the rhythmic tapping of rain on the roof and the soft rustle of the blanket as we adjusted unconsciously to sit closer. I told her a story, something silly from my childhood, and she laughed, that soft, genuine laugh that always caught me off guard. She shared a memory of her own, something vulnerable but light. The conversation slowed, words becoming fewer, pauses becoming longer. At one point, my hand brushed against hers beneath the blanket. It wasn't planned. It just happened, the kind of accidental touch that lingers because neither person moves away. Her fingers didn't flinch. In fact, they stayed there, against mine, warm and steady. We sat like that, side by side, as the rain fell around us, not rushing toward anything, just letting the world outside disappear for a little while. In that soft, quiet storm, the tension between us finally stopped hiding. It breathed. It lived. Something about that night on the porch changed the way we saw each other. After that, every glance carried a quiet weight, every moment stretched just a little longer than it should have. We didn't cross any obvious lines, but inside, both of us knew, we were already standing at the edge. A few evenings later, I found her sitting alone at the kitchen table, surrounded by half-folded laundry. The rain had stopped days ago, but the house felt just as quiet as that night. She looked up when I entered, surprised but not displeased. "You're becoming a regular," she said softly, folding a towel with deliberate focus. I shrugged with a smile, taking a seat across from her. "Maybe I just like the company." For a moment, we exchanged small talk, but it felt different this time, like both of us were avoiding the real thing hovering between us. Finally, I exhaled, my heart pounding against my ribs. "Can I tell you something?" She paused mid-fold, sensing the shift in my tone. "Of course." I leaned forward slightly, hands clasped together. "I don't really know how this happened. I didn't plan it. But every time I'm here, every time we talk, it feels like the rest of the world goes quiet." And I hesitated, searching for the right words. "I care about you. More than I probably should." The silence that followed was thick. She set the towel down slowly, her eyes fixed on mine. Her usual playful composure softened, revealing something fragile beneath. She didn't speak right away. When she did, her voice was steady but laced with conflict. "You know this isn't simple," she said. "You're younger, people would talk, they'd misunderstand. And me," she looked down, fingers tracing the edge of the table. "I've spent so long being strong, sensible, responsible. I don't let people in easily. I can't afford to." I reached across the table, hesitating only for a second before resting my hand gently over hers. "I'm not asking for anyone else's approval," I said quietly. "I just wanted to be honest. With you." Her eyes met mine again, and this time they glistened faintly, not with sadness, but with the kind of emotion people try to keep hidden. She didn't pull her hand away. Instead, she turned it slightly, letting our fingers intertwine, slow and deliberate. "I haven't felt this, alive in a long time," she whispered, almost to herself. And in that quiet kitchen, surrounded by folded towels and unspoken fears, our honesty finally caught up with us. There were no dramatic declarations, no grand gestures, just two people facing the truth between them, gently but completely. After that night, something settled between us. It wasn't rushed, and it wasn't reckless. It was quiet, like a tide that had finally stopped pulling and started to rest against the shore. Neither of us said anything dramatic about what we felt, we didn't need to. The air itself carried the shift. A few days later, she invited me to stay for dinner. Not in a hesitant, secretive way, but simply, warmly. "I made too much," she said with a smile that felt different now. I stepped inside, and the house smelled like sautéed garlic and fresh herbs. She was barefoot in the kitchen, hair loosely tied, sleeves rolled up as she stirred something on the stove. The domestic simplicity of it all made my chest tighten in a way I couldn't quite explain. We cooked together that evening. She handed me ingredients with quiet trust, laughed when I messed up slicing the bread, and brushed my wrist lightly when she reached past me. It wasn't forced, it flowed. For the first time, there was no undercurrent of uncertainty or hesitation between us. Just warmth. At the table, the conversation drifted between playful teasing and honest reflections. She told me about her dreams from years ago, the things she once wanted before life took its turns. I listened, fascinated, realizing how much of her I'd only seen in fragments before. She looked at me differently too, not as a boy lingering in her kitchen, but as someone who had quietly walked into her life and stayed. When the dishes were done and the house grew quieter, I found myself standing near the doorway, ready to leave but not quite wanting to. She stepped closer, drying her hands on a towel, her expression soft. "You know," she said, almost in a whisper, "this is the first time in a long while I've felt at peace." I didn't say anything. Instead, I gently lifted my hand and brushed a stray strand of hair away from her face. My palm rested lightly against her cheek, warm against her skin. She closed her eyes for a brief second and leaned into my touch, just enough to let me feel her quiet acceptance. No words were needed after that. It wasn't a fairy tale ending, and it wasn't a reckless promise. It was something real, two people choosing to meet each other exactly where they were, without rushing the moment. As I stepped out into the cool night, I glanced back at her standing in the doorway, light spilling around her. And for the first time, I didn't feel like I was leaving. I felt like something had just begun.